how does the cult of Kim Jong Un differ from that of his father and grandfather?
Uh, well, I think that the West has been mistaken in claiming that Kim Jong Un has distanced himself from Kim Jong Il in order to concentrate more on evoking associations with his grandfather. This is really very much a military first kind of personality cult. His public image is much closer to that of his father than to his grandfather. And this is one reason why I think the myth is not as vulnerable as some people think. Uh, when you look at it, uh, we need to keep in mind that both Kim Jong Il and Kim Jong Un have lived up to their billing more than Kim Il Sung did. Remember, the great leader was praised for liberating his people from Japan, defeating the Yankees in the Korean War, and then rebuilding the country afterwards. And all of those things had in fact been done for him by outside powers. Now, Kim Jong Il and Kim Jong Un are both glorified for nuclearizing the country and standing up to Washington. And whether we think that's praiseworthy or not, the praise is grounded in truth, and no amount of heterodox foreign information flowing into North Korea can really threaten that myth. The problem continues to be, and this is a big difference with the cult of both his predecessors, Kim Jong-un's years in Switzerland, because they preclude the kind of biographical legend that the other leaders got. So this guy has got to make his own myth in the present, which puts pressure on him to rack up military exploits. In the meantime, what I see as the main propaganda effort and the main expense has been the glorification of his father. The outside world has kind of missed out on this a bit. But that's how they're legitimizing this kid, really, by inflating the stature of the man who picked him for the job. Now, when Kim Jong-il was alive, as I'm sure you remember, and right up until he died in late 2011, he was always presented as being 2 or 3 sizes smaller than his father in every way. And that difference in stature has been very greatly reduced in a short period of time. The regime is now intent, and you can see this in the statues that went up in Pyongyang, intent on the public's perceiving the two dead Kims as standing side by side almost as equals. In the statues of them on horseback, the Kim Jong-il's horse is rearing up, so they're even of equal height. And what's even more interesting, really, is that the age difference between the two men has been reduced as well. The age difference looks much too small for those statues to be representing an actual point in history. And I think we're dealing here with that very strange North Korean mythical relationship to time. It's almost an ancient Greek kind of relationship. They live completely in the here and now in North Korea with this compressed recent mythological past that is constantly made to feel as immediate as possible, as fresh as possible. And this is why Kim Il-sung's birthplace always looks brand new. When I was there 2 years ago, I could see other foreigners laughing at it or smiling at it, but because it looks so new. But to the North Koreans, it must never be allowed to take on the patina of real age, of real history. This is another reason why I reject the notion of a Confucian North Korea, because the Confucian relationship to the past was very much more like our own. Anyway, this is how the regime is indirectly glorifying Kim Jong-un by puffing up his father and making sure that his granddad's myth, which is really the most important source of legitimacy for the entire regime, feels as recent as it did 15 years ago. This is why you have all that talk of an eternal president and an eternal general secretary. So everything's okay if Kim Jong-un doesn't screw it up. And I get the impression that this is the first leader in North Korean history who really just does not grasp propaganda very well.
And I'd like to pick you up on that. How do you think North Koreans view Kim Jong-un compared to Kim Il-sung? Joshua Stanton wrote today, North Koreans will hold Kim Jong-un in contempt if they see him as having abandoned his grandfather's aura of dignity, national superiority and rigid principle. If the leaders aren't faithful to the core principles, why should anyone else respect the system?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, one thing we need to keep in mind, of course, is that however the North Korean people feel about their leader, they are intensely proud of their state. There is an unshakable loyalty to the North Korean state, which is completely unlike what you have here in South Korea, where people really could care less about their republic. And in an extreme, radical, ultra-nationalist state, the leader becomes equated with the state, which in turn is equated with the race. So that even if people don't like the leader, they feel that turning their back on him would somehow be betraying the race itself. And we hear this from refugees who've crossed the river. I heard one refugee told me that, you know, when he was crossing the river, he really felt as if he was betraying the race. Even though he was highly dissatisfied with the regime, he still felt he was doing something terrible. So I think that just as, say, an English monarch has to go very, very far for the English public to feel that that person should be replaced, dissatisfaction with Kim Jong Un is going to have to be very, very high for the people to really start voicing dissatisfaction or really start getting rebellious. But he's doing such a bad job so far of things. You know, he's started doing a bad job very soon. The way he was allowing himself to be filmed and photographed, laughing and smiling broadly only a few weeks after his father had died. I think that was very unwise. Now, all the stuff with the amusement parks and all the luxury facilities that the propaganda apparatus insists on showing on TV, I understand that the regime wants to project a kind of FDR, happy days are here again, kind of message. The people have been through an awful lot of hardship, and it does make a certain amount of propaganda sense to say to the people, we are now strong enough, we've made enough progress on the military front, that you can relax a little bit. That's an important message, and I think there's truth to that as well. I wonder sometimes why our media seem to interpret all these signs of relaxation in Pyongyang, these signs of coffee shops and miniskirts and things like this, as symptoms of the weakness of the regime. I interpret them as symptoms of the strength of the regime. This is a regime which is confident enough of its hold over public opinion to loosen the reins a little bit. The problem is that Kim Jong Un really should not be the person who is embodying the happy days are here again message. This should be spread by other people than himself, because it was always a very vital part of Kim Jong-il's myth that he was so busy defending the country against the American threat that he really had no time for himself. And that's where these two Dennis Rodman episodes were really so disastrous. I mean, if I were a CIA mole planted in the regime in Pyongyang, that's the kind of thing I would have advised him to engage in. And those errors strengthen my conviction that he really is in charge. He really is pulling the strings, because if somebody else were pulling the strings for him, they would not have let him do something so stupid and do it twice. I mean, if you want to look to your own people as if you have foreign admirers, you don't invite some has-been basketball player who's going to wear a hat and sunglasses in your presence. And if you want someone to spread propaganda for you, then you grant an exclusive audience to the most sympathetic Pyongyang watchers out there. I could give them a couple names if they wanted them, whom, you know, Washington would then forever consider the ultimate experts on the country. Or you could meet people, doing business or collaborating with the government and reward them in that way and turn them into very effective agents of propaganda. You don't waste that kind of photo op on Dennis Rodman, because it's all too obvious that the person most interested in meeting Dennis Rodman was Kim Jong Un himself.
Yeah, and you think that's bad because people in the leadership, colleagues in the leadership, and the general population can see that, or why is that so bad? Well,
it's not. I mean, it's all part of the general trend in propaganda that we've been seeing in the past 2 years. I mean, it goes hand in hand with him showing off his wife, and playing the happy young couple in a country where it's not very easy for the average man to get married before the age of 30. Um, it doesn't sit well with the whole military first image. And as you know, one of the reasons I consider North Korea to be a far right state is not simply because it has a race oriented view of the world, but because it's it fits really the central defining characteristic of a far right or a fascist state, which is the militarization of society in peacetime, the maintenance of a war atmosphere in peacetime. I mean, you could say that America has been, constantly engaged in wars for the past 15 or 20 years, but our society is not militarized, whereas North Korea has a higher portion of its population in military uniform than Nazi Germany or fascist Italy had in the 1930s. And just as in those fascist countries, this militarization is not aimed so much at defending the country as aimed at internal unity, aimed at legitimizing the state and forcing a kind of unity which would be impossible otherwise. But in order to keep that atmosphere going, the leader himself must be conveying some kind of urgency. He must look to his people as if he's the one who's most concerned for the security of the country. Of course, Kim Jong Un has been visiting plenty of military bases as well, but I do wonder if the other things that he's been doing and the activities with his wife and Dennis Rodman and so on are not, canceling that message out a bit.
Yeah. And that's interesting. So if we rewind then back to March and April when there were the supposed tensions,
Right.
I'd ask you, were those tensions a crisis of reporting in the Western media, or was this really a faux crisis put on by the North Korean propagandists to try and really escalate that military tension you've just been talking about?
Again, we have to go back to the concept of different tracks of propaganda, which we discussed the last time we talked. Usually, the external propaganda track, the track which is aimed at the outside world exclusively, tries to convey the image of a country that is desperate for peace. But in last spring, what we had last spring was the very odd situation in which the external track was actually more bellicose than the internal track. And that bellicosity continued much longer than it did in the internal track, or even in the outer track of the domestic propaganda. So if you look at the Nodong Shinmun, for example, the party organ in early May, it's actually a much more placid impression that you get from that than you were getting from the KCNA's English language press releases. Now, that originally inclined me to think that we were not as close to war as the North Korean government wanted us to think we were. What has made me doubt my original interpretation of events recently has been the arrest of Lee Seok-gi, that United Progressive Party lawmaker, for participating in a seditious meeting, allegedly seditious meeting, where the participants allegedly described what they would do if North Korea were to attack. Now, there is, I think, very little debate as to that party's pro-North Korean tendencies, and we know that members of that party and that whole movement, that whole pro-North Korean movement, have been in quite close contact with North Korea. It's certainly uncanny how they conduct demonstrations against certain issues about a day after the North Korean media expresses opposition to them. Now, this is relevant because many people were surprised that this so-called RO group, this revolutionary organization group, that those people had paid so little attention to the normal security precautions when they held this meeting last spring. Usually, members of this organization or any kind of seditious pro-North organization are very careful to keep meetings to a bare minimum of participants. We know that many of the people who were arrested for spying in the 1980s had not even met each other before, even though they were in the same organization. So the question arises, why were these people so reckless in meeting in May? Of course, if it turns out that the NIS has simply fabricated the whole affair, then we have an answer right there. But it does not look like that at the moment. Several people are starting to talk to the interrogators about what went on. It does look like the NIS has a pretty solid case. So the logical conclusion to draw is that Lee Seok-gi felt urgent enough about the likelihood of a war breaking out between the two Koreas that he threw caution to the wind and asked everybody to turn up at the location. So they brought their kids with them. One guy turned up drunk and so on. And of course, that ultimately led to the downfall of the whole thing. But you've got to ask yourself, why would somebody very well connected to North Korea suddenly feel it was urgent enough to call a meeting? So that's where I have to say I really don't know just how close we were in last spring. Maybe we'll never know.
Well, maybe we'll find out next spring.
Yeah, maybe we will. Maybe this will be. Of course, I mean, these things do serve an internal propaganda function. And even though the internal propaganda was not nearly as bad as it was here, they were, putting camouflage netting on the buses in Pyongyang and so on. The regime needs this atmosphere. Every time, with every liberalization or every step that is made to loosen the economy and to loosen, let's say, the official culture a little bit, the regime has to make up for that periodically by ratcheting up the tension and reminding the people that this is a military-first country, and this is the modus operandi that we saw in fascist Europe as well.
Now. Kim Jong Un, outside of the military, he has been doing things differently, you could say, to Kim Jong Il. A couple of things really come to mind. Firstly, of course, is his apparent embrace of redefectors coming back to North Korea. And then there is the other issue of the South Korean flag flying on national TV in North Korea at a recent sports event for the first time. Do you think this is almost like a attempt to legitimize the country in that out-of-track propaganda you're talking about for foreigners, or things are changing? What do you think on that?
It's difficult to say because, as I said, he's so inept at managing his own public image that I think it would be dangerous to look for some very clever motivation behind the various measures that are taken in the rest of the country's propaganda. That business with the flag was, to me, much more significant than the sort of things that were fussed over last year, like the Mickey Mouse concert and so on, because that is the one thing that they seem to have been allergic to all this time, which is kind of funny when you think that Kim Il-sung flew that same flag until they established the North Korean Republic. I think what would have made it worse for them would have been had there been a significant South Korean cheering contingent, because just as we can, in the old days, we could look at a Soviet athlete, watch him as his flag was raised and think, well, the poor devil doesn't really want to live in the USSR, but it's still a nice day for him, and so on. If you had in Pyongyang this South Korean cheering contingent waving the South Korean flag and showing pride, not just in the athletic achievement itself, which is what the athletes were showing pride in, but pride in their state, I think that would have been much more problematic to the North Korean regime. And let's face it, the South Korean flag continues to function, at least in South Korea, not as a symbol of the state, but as a symbol of the race. And I think in that sense, it's something that the effect of which could be contained. I don't believe that this is something which is going to set the North Koreans' heads spinning. We'd have to see another indication of something down the line. It could simply have been the North Korean government feeling that it needs to allow these things in order to host international events, which bring very big image benefits for the regime as well.
Hmm. And are there any other things that you've noticed over the last couple of years that are different about that internal propaganda, I guess, that the leadership have been cultivating when
Well,
compared?
yeah, compared to before, obviously there's been an increase in polish. Hold on, motorcycle going by. I
Yeah,
don't know if you heard that.
yeah.
Um, there's been a continuous increase in the polish of North Korean propaganda, which is natural because um, every year the regime has to compete more and more against other sources of entertainment and information. So the regime simply cannot continue putting out the same very low budgeted movies, for example, with one camera zooming in and out. And they can't continue putting out that very dry kind of North Korean propaganda literature that all has to be spiced up. So that was predictable enough. I focus on the personality cult. I was very interested to see, to read these depictions of Kim Jong Un's on the spot guidance, because this, of course, is a very old tradition in North Korea.
Yes.
And what you had under Kim Il sung and Kim Jong il were these sort of novelistic descriptions of on the spot guidance that were told by a kind of omniscient narrator in a very literary style. In other words, the dear leader Kim Jong il turned and smiled. He was thinking about his mother when he was a little boy, etc. That style of writing, which seems very comical to us, of course. Now, what you're getting now in North Korea, and whether this is due to the rise in polish or whether it is due to a certain embarrassment about glorifying Kim Jong Un, what you're getting is the average story will be a worker walking home from the factory after Kim Jong Un has visited the factory. So the worker is thinking back in very broad brush strokes, so to speak, on Kim Jong Un's visit. Okay, and of course he's recalling it in very warm terms, but it's all done much more vaguely and rapidly. There's less sort of glorying or reveling in the description of the person, and you're left with a very vague idea of what kind of person Kim Jong Un is. So I get the impression that the personality cult still hasn't figured out what kind of character to glorify him as. Okay, you got a very clear distinction in North Korean propaganda between Kim Il sung's personality, this bubbly, vivacious personality, and Kim Jong il, who was always portrayed as being slightly wistful. He was always thinking about his late father, and he was always thinking about the hardship that his people were going through and worrying about the American threat. You had a very clear distinction between the two. Whereas if you look at propaganda devoted to Kim Jong Un and the poetry, the poems that are coming out praising Kim Jong Un, it really is simply a case of sticking the new name in very old propaganda contexts. Instead of saying, he's our happiness or he's our sunshine, Kim Jong il is our sunshine, they're saying Kim Jong Un is our sunshine. And that's, I think, not sufficient. In a state like this, you have to inspire the people. It's not enough just to be treading water like this. So I guess it remains to be seen whether the regime is going to get its act together.
Yeah, I mean, we actually had some pictures published on NK News of that a tourist took of some signage that you could literally see them just changing il to un in the Korean, and very, very simplistic transfer of personality cult, I guess. But yeah, and one other difference though, which a number of people have picked up on over the last 18 months or so, is of course Kim Jong Un. His petty rants, which seem almost unprecedented. There was, of course, the visit to the theme park. There was a football match earlier this summer where something allegedly happened, and Kim Jong Un was forced to take decisive action. It's been very rare to see this kind of very direct criticism from the leadership to the, I guess, the people. What do you think's behind that? Is this just
No,
again?
well, it's not rare. It's actually not as rare as people
Oh,
think. This is it really has a very long tradition, I think, throughout really around the totalitarian historical world. Really, it's a traditional propaganda device for the leader to basically bash the middleman, to use the ilgun, what the North Koreans call ilgun, or officials, as whipping boys. Kim Il-sung started doing this in the late 1950s. There was that very short thaw, sort of the closest thing that North Korea ever came to 100 flowers kind of thaw in the late 1950s, when you had mildly critical poetry coming out, poetry criticizing officials. And Kim Il-sung, ever since the 50s, really has been engaged in ritual, was engaged in ritual criticism of officials for letting the country down. Kim Jong-il did an awful lot of this as well, and much of the famine too was blamed on officials not pulling their weight. In fact, the party secretary at the remote country factory or farm is really quite a negative figure, a surprisingly negative figure. Kim Jong-il is described in one short story as saying these people really have to get on the ball because they're letting everybody down and they're thwarting the legacy and so on. So this is not anything new at all. If anything, it's a little bit odd in that he is venting his anger at officials for not keeping an amusement park properly weeded. Another dumb move, I think, because the average North Korean in the rest of the country could give a damn whether this wonderful amusement park in Pyongyang is being properly weeded or not. He needs to be, if he's going to do ranting and complaining, he needs to be complaining about the sort of issues that the North Korean people are struggling with.
yes. And those people, of course, this year and I think last have been legally traveling to neighboring countries in record numbers, and yet the propaganda still holds. Why do you think that is? That these
Hey,
people,
that's where I say, I rest my case. This is further evidence, if any further evidence were needed, that this is not a failed communist state. Can you imagine if it had been as easy for East Germans to leave their country and travel around as it now is for the North Koreans to do it, and yet the country still holds. The country continues, the regime continues to enjoy mainstream support, and those people, the vast majority of them, go back to North Korea and continue working for the system, and that includes people, all these technocrats who've gone overseas to China or whatever for technical education. We just have to come to terms with the fact that economic superiority or unlimited economic growth is not the be-all and end-all for everybody around the world. And the North Koreans like their state and are, for the most part, happy living in their state, even though they're fully aware that in mere economic terms, I would say, in mere economic terms, the country is still lagging behind. If you accept the North Korean studies orthodoxy that North Korea's main obsession has always been strict self-reliance and all that nonsense, then naturally you would have to draw the conclusion that North Korea has failed as a state, and you would therefore expect the people to have turned their back on it. But precisely because the actual obsession of the country is unification, and therefore the military buildup which must necessarily precede unification, they see their country as being on an upward arc, and they do not consider themselves to be worse off than people 20 or 30 years ago. Whether or not they really are worse off is a different question. They don't see themselves, they don't see the country as in a downward spiral at all. I think this is one point where the people who are, working with North Korea and going in and out of there, people who are otherwise, I think, very hostile to the sort of things I have to say, will agree with me, because I hear them saying much the same sort of thing as well. These signs of the society loosening up are signs of a regime that is very safely and squarely ensconced in power, for the time being at least.
Hmm. And in terms of your outlook for the next 5 years, do you see anything threatening that?
Well, the main problem always is that this country has to sporadically ratchet up the tension with the outside world. Uh, everything rests on the perception of North Korea as being exceptionally strong and yet being under a constant threat from the race enemy. So North Korea may be able to, allow fast food restaurants to come in and allow miniskirts to keep rising and all those things to happen. What it cannot do is simply sit back and allow normalcy to establish itself in North Korean life. So we're going to continue to see things like we saw last spring, and things like the Yeonpyeong Island attack and missile launches and so on. So the question really of how long North Korea can survive should instead be phrased as the question, how much will the outside world put up with, especially South Korea? Personally, I was convinced about 5 years ago that by this time, North Korea would have already have gone too far. And I think had South Korea been a normal republic, in the sense of a republic where people really stand behind their state and really identify with the integrity of the state, I think that red line would have been crossed in November 2010 with the Yeonpyeong Island attack. And I remember watching it on my TV here at home and thinking, okay, this is it. This is it, finally. And yet it didn't happen because the South Koreans felt that the occasional bombardment of their territory is perhaps a small price to pay for avoiding all-out war. And I don't aim to criticize that decision that they made, and I think that we Americans are too ready to go to war. But my point is, if South Korea has decided that is willing to put up with a ritual humiliation or two from Pyongyang every year and a half, and still keep trying to do business with the North Koreans, and still try to keep propping up that state, then it may very well make it out of this decade after all.
Wow. So what would you recommend then to I guess South Korea in?
Well, what I've been recommending to South Korean audiences now for about 2 years is something that really has become kind of a trend in the new right discourse anyway, which is that South Korea needs to recognize that it has a state consciousness problem, a 국가 정신 problem, in the sense that South Koreans feel more loyalty to the race than they do to their own state. And I believe that if South Korea counters that and finally establishes for the first time in South Korean history a real sense of public loyalty to the state as a political entity, then not only will they make great headway in the fight against corruption and things like that, but they will also, I think, do much to demotivate North Korea. I continue to believe that North Korea is not arming in the hope of, bombing South Korea. It is arming in the hope of becoming strong enough to bully the South Koreans into submission. And part of that calculation, I think, comes from the North Korean assumption that a significant amount of South Koreans would not do anything and would actually be sympathetic to North Korea. And so far, that assumption has been correct. I mean, I have heard estimates that about 10% of the South Korean people think that North Korea is the better of the two states. And that 10% could conceivably play a crucial role if it ever came to a showdown between the two states. So if South Korea is able to create the kind of state spirit that West Germany had in the 1970s and 1980s, and then convey that completely unified state spirit to North Korea, much as the West Germans did vis-a-vis East Germany, then I think we could see North Korea coming to terms with the preposterousness of its plans. So I think a lot more attention has to be put on that side of things.